Well, welcome everyone to our second video, discussion of systems theory. And so with our discussion of systems theory, we're again progressing through our evolution of the organization theory literature. Now we're moving into 60s, 70s, and 80s. And still, I would argue this is still a modern theory today, in that when we view our organizations in systems theory, we're looking beyond the walls of the organization and we're acknowledging that the organization exists within this bigger environment, and essentially that the organization is part of a bigger type of system, a bigger type of environment. So with systems theory, we tend to enter into a much more complex and complicated and nuanced way of looking at our organizations. So in systems theory, we're taking very much of this holistic view. And it's also a very rational type of perspective because we are seeing the organization as the instrument for achieving goals within this larger context of a much bigger external environment. So it's kind of this 30,000-foot helicopter view of our organizations much more holistically than we'd have with one of our past types of theories where we were looking just within the organization itself. One of the most effective ways to talk about systems theory is to divide it up into different perspectives. So one perspective of systems theory is what's called natural or closed systems theory. Another perspective is known as open systems theory. So with natural or closed systems theory perspective, natural systems theorists will view organizations similar to being living organisms. As living organisms, the primary goal of these organizations is to try and survive. So, not to depress you too much, but just like any living organism, from the moment an organism is born, it then struggles to survive. It starts decaying, it starts dissipating energy into its environment, and its struggle is then to try and survive into the future. In order to survive, all organisms must be able to adapt to their surrounding environment. Natural systems perspective looks at this adaptation process internal to the organization. So it looks at what does this drive for survival mean for the internal environment within the organization. Hence the reason why it's referred to as a natural or a closed type of perspective. In contrast to that natural, that closed perspective, you then have the open systems perspective. Although it shares a lot of similarities to the natural perspective, an open systems perspective looks beyond the walls of the organization and looks at that external environment and really introduces the idea of a two-way street. That not only does the environment affect the organization, but the organization can also have impacts upon its environment. So it's kind of this reciprocal relationship between the organization and its external environment. Despite their differences, there are some commonalities between natural and open systems theory. Both approaches assume that systems do not have a concrete existence. This is a very important point. They assume that organizations and the systems in which they operate do not exist forever, that these organizations, these systems are dynamic and they can go out of existence in the future. So there's no concrete existence that is guaranteed or ensured for these organizations or their environments. Systems theory is really based upon the creation of these conceptual frameworks to help us understand the internal and external environments of our organization by focusing on the interdependence of all the different elements in that internal and external environment. Both of these approaches, closed as well as open systems theory, their primary goal, the primary goal of all organizations, is to try and achieve this balance, this steady state, this point of equilibrium. So what we look at with both closed as well as open systems theory is how these organizations work toward this equilibrium. This equilibrium, this balance point, is a dynamic equilibrium, which means that, again, it's not concrete. It changes. The balance that was appropriate today may not be the same balance that is appropriate tomorrow or the next day. But all organisms, all organizations struggle to try and achieve this steady state, this balance. In both natural as well as open systems theory, this balance point, this equilibrium, is referred to as their point of homeostasis. So we're borrowing a word from the natural sciences, borrowing a word from biology, homeostasis. Homeostasis is this balance, it's this equilibrium, the regulation of internal structures and processes to then adapt to and balance with the external environment. So the difference with homeostasis between natural and open systems theory is the focus is more internal with natural systems theory. So understanding that organizations have to adapt to their environment, our focus in natural systems theory is the balance within the organization. So kind of creating that state of organizational harmony within the organization itself. For an open systems theorist, the balance is more a balance between the organization and its external environment. So let's kind of delve into the nuts and bolts of natural systems theory. Then we'll talk about a segue to then take us into the nuts and bolts of open systems theory. So natural systems theory, one of the primary authors in natural systems theory is our good friend Chester Barnard, who we've talked about twice already in this course, and we're going to talk about him again in systems theory. Chester Barnard made his argument, as you know in our discussion of HR, that his argument is that for leaders and managers to be successful, their success is predicated upon the compliance on the part of their employees. He assumes kind of this transactional cooperative system within organizations. So organizations need to cooperate with their employees to achieve their goals. So organizations, in order to be successful, need to obtain resources and then utilize those resources in the form of incentives to then extract contributions from the members of that organization. So we'll use the resources to create these rewards, these incentives, then provide those incentives to our employees to incentivize them, motivate them to then provide the contributions the organization needs in order to accomplish organizational goals. According to Barnard, this equilibrium, this homeostasis point, is the point at which there is a balance not only between the organization and its environment, but a balance within the organization as well, where there is a proper balance between the incentives, the rewards being given to employees, and the contributions that you are able to extract from those employees. According to Barnard, an efficient organization is one in which the contributions that you receive from your employees will exceed the net dissatisfaction of those employees. So that's efficiency if your contributions are exceeding the dissatisfaction of your employees. Employees, whenever you are asking them to contribute to the organization, those employees could become dissatisfied because they're being asked to do more and more and to provide more and more contributions. But if you find that balance where you're getting the contributions you need and the net balance of those contributions exceed the dissatisfaction that's causing among employees, that's the point of efficiency for an organization. For Barnard, the measurement of organizational effectiveness is how well the organization has achieved its goals. Then we also know with Barnard, with his zones of indifference that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we also know that in order to get this compliance from employees, you need to make sure that you are not violating their ethical principles. You need to work within what Barnard refers to as the employee's zone of indifference. The more you operate within the zone of indifference and provide them with the right set of incentives, the more likely they are to comply, the more likely they are to provide the contributions needed to the organization. Again, for our natural systems theorists such as Barnard, we're really looking at the internal balance within the organization. So according to Barnard, in order to achieve this balance in the internal system, what executives need to do is they need to do three things. Number one, they need to develop a system of communication so that they know what types of incentives, what types of rewards are valued by employees, the valence level they place upon those employees, upon those rewards, in order to extract the right amount of contributions from those employees. So you need to have this system of communication. You need to induce people to buy into the organization and then extract the contributions from them. And then third, executives need to define clearly the goals of the organization so that you know the right set of contributions you need to get from your employees in order to achieve those organizational goals. And this is what Barnard refers to as the functions of the executive. And his most famous work was actually titled The Functions of the Executive. Now, Barnard and natural systems theory, one of the primary criticisms is the same criticism we had for Barnard back when we talked about him with human relations theory. And that is that he accepts as unquestioned the hierarchical authority that was a basic staple of the classic theorists like Weber and Taylor. He's really talking about this transactional relationship between organizational leaders and employees, how you make these transactions in order to acquire contributions from those employees. It's a very top-down, very tall, hierarchical type of an approach, which at times can tend to be relatively anti-democratic. Even though you have a communication system, you're still working to extract contributions from these employees. So they, again, kind of look and feel a little bit more like those cogs in the machinery that Taylor was discussing. And there's little justification provided by Barnard for this social control of employees within organizations. But again, Chester Barnard and natural systems theorists, what they're looking at is their ideal is to find this balance in the organization between contributions and rewards, and that will then make for an efficient and an effective organization. So for the models of organizational effectiveness with Barnard and natural systems theorists, I think you see a little bit of all of the different models of organizational effectiveness with maybe less of an emphasis, obviously, on the open systems model. Clearly, there's human relations. Clearly, it's an internal process focus. Clearly, you're identifying and conceptualizing your organizational goals. So there's certainly a goal attainment type of model here, rational goal model. Just a little bit less so, I think, in terms of the open systems approach. In terms of your methods for coordination control, a lot of direct supervision, a lot of standardization of worker values. In terms of your motivational strategies, you've got instrumental rewards because obviously you're providing rewards for performance. There is some considerate leadership because you are communicating with your employees to try and see what they value, the balance levels they place on all these potential outcomes and potential rewards. There is some group acceptance as well, understanding that affiliation type of motivation. And clearly there's a lot of goal congruence in that the better you can align individual goals with organizational goals, the better you can be successful as an organization. But again, the focus here with natural systems theory is much more of a closed focus, looking within the organization and the balance within that organization itself. Really looking for those indicators of organizational harmony within the organization. A nice segue to move us from natural systems theory to a discussion of open systems theory is this theorist by the name of Robert Merton, and what Tompkins refers to as structural functional theory. Merton, in his structural functional theory, sometimes referred to as middle range theory, is a nice segue because Merton starts to question some of the assumptions that underpinned the closed system approach. Closed system natural systems theorists looked at organizations as being living organisms. Merton starts to question that. He questions this whole analogy of an organization as an organism. He makes the argument that organizations engage in activities that are not necessarily conducive to the achievement of goals. So not every activity an organization engages in is done to try and achieve the goals of the organization. Not every activity engaged in by an organization will ensure that organization's survival. Sometimes organizations will make decisions and engage in behaviors that do not necessarily promote the long-term survival of the organization. Organizations have been known to take risks and do things that are almost counterintuitive. Not every activity engaged by an organization is indispensable for agency survival. And I think if you work in any type of bureaucratic organization, you could probably very quickly count off at least a dozen activities that that organization is doing that probably are not indispensable to the existence and survival of that organization. So whereas the natural systems there is really focused on organizational survival, and you find that homeostasis, you find that balance point to help promote the survival of the organization. Now, what Merton is doing is he's shifting our focus more from survival to the consequences on people of the everyday goods and services and products that are being created by that organization. So, what Merton's functional theory tells us is that policies and behaviors will remain in organizations as long as the net consequences of those policies and behaviors are positive for our beneficiaries, for the people we are serving, for the people who are consuming the services and programs we are creating. So it really focuses our attention on the consequences, on the beneficiaries of these policies and these programs that we are implementing. The problem, according to Merton, is that there are all these bureaucratic dysfunctions that oftentimes occur, especially in larger, older, more established bureaucratic organizations. As organizations age, according to Merton, they tend to become more institutionally rigid. They grow in size, they grow in fragmentation, they become much more complex, they develop a lot of rules and policies and regulations, and that then leads to what he calls goal displacement, where the focus of the organization will be on adhering to those policies and those rules as opposed to serving the needs of our beneficiaries. When you focus too much on your rules and your regulations, you create a very institutionally rigid organization, and you build these walls between the organization and the beneficiaries that organization is supposed to serve. That institutional rigidity will then cause conflicts between bureaucrats and the public, taking us back to Charles Goodsell and the reason why people have such a negative view of the bureaucracy. Here is your gridlock. Here is your red tape. Here is your impersonal treatment of people. Here are all those negative aspects of bureaucratic organizations. Merton says that all comes from these bureaucratic dysfunctions of over-conforming to rules and regulations. And rather than focusing on the survival of the organization, we should instead focus on the consequences on our beneficiaries. This is a very similar theme that we saw with Osborne and Gabler in the 1990s with the reinvention of government. In that reinvention of government in the Clinton-Gore administration, the primary emphasis of that reinvention was to try and shift the focus away from just our daily activities and shift that focus more to the consequences that these activities are having on our citizens and looking at how well we are fulfilling the wants and the needs of those citizens. So shifting externally to a look at our external consumers, our external stakeholders. That shift more to the external, looking at external stakeholders, is what really serves as our nice bridge, our nice segue away from closed natural systems theory into a focus more on open systems theory when we start to take into account the external environment and those stakeholders out there in that external environment. But before we get to that point, as we always do, let's go back and look at the models of organizational effectiveness with Robert Merton and structural functional theory. I think with Merton, you can say there's an emphasis on all four of those models. Certainly, we're looking internal to the organization. We're looking at a human relations type of approach. We have goals that we have identified, but now we're also turning our attention to the external environment in very much of an open systems type of model. In terms of our mechanisms for coordination and control, I don't think we really highlight any of those because it depends. It will depend upon the consumers, the citizens that we are serving. The types of methods we're going to use to coordinate and control our work will depend upon the goods and the services and the programs that are meeting the needs of our citizens. So every citizen has a different set of wants and needs. And so therefore, there's no one approach that's highlighted in terms of mechanisms for coordination and control. Recognizing that individual citizens all have their own sets of wants and needs and desires, that is a reflection of, if you remember back when we talked about Thompson's typology of technologies, my favorite alliteration, that Thompson tells us this third type of technology, the intensive technology, is when you are dealing with individual citizens in a different manner, in that every individual citizen must be dealt with differently because they have a different set of wants and needs. And then in terms of your motivational strategy, I think it's the same thing applies. The motivational strategy that is used in structural functional theory really does depend upon our citizens and really depends upon the consequences we are trying to create for individual citizens. But again, the reason why we talk about Merton and structural functional theory kind of sandwiched in between natural and open systems is that by looking at the consequences on external stakeholders, we have now shifted our focus more into the external environment, which leads us directly into open systems theory. And it's clearer focus and more direct focus on the external environment and this reciprocal relationship between the organization and its external environment. Open systems theorists like Katz and Kahn will argue that organizations must adapt to their dynamic environments, and they must adapt aggressively to their dynamic changing environments. And the reason why they need to adapt aggressively to their changing environments is this concept known as negative entropy. Now, in the natural systems theory, we assume that whenever organizations were born, they are like living organisms. And from the time they are created, they are going to start this process of decaying and dissipating energy into the environment until at some point in time, they will have dissipated so many resources in the environment that they no longer have the resources required to continue to survive and exist as an organization. That process of dissipating energy and resources into your environment, that's a process that's known as entropy. So entropy is the process of dissipating resources, losing resources until you go out of existence. Open systems theorists argue that organizations don't always naturally go out of existence, in that there's this process known as negative entropy. And that for all those resources that are dissipated into the external environment, organizations can then aggressively import new resources from the environment into the organization. So organizations do not always deteriorate and go out of existence. They can obtain these new energies, these new resources, bring them into the organization, and that will then allow the organization to survive into the future. Those resources, as we have talked about in previous class sessions, are things such as an adequate labor pool, appropriations, grant money, political support, support from elected officials, support from constituent groups, from the public. Those are all the types of resources that can be imported from your external environment to then help your organization survive into the future. The point of homeostasis for open systems theory is the proper balance between the organization and its environment, where the environment supports the organization supports its external environment. An important concept in open systems theory is this concept known as equifinality. Equifinality says there are a number of different paths that organizations can pursue to achieve this point of homeostasis, to achieve this proper steady state, this proper balance between the organization and the external environment. This really does feed very much into our basic theme of the class, which is my favorite answer: it depends. The path that an organization takes to find the balance with its environment will depend upon the organization as well as the characteristics in that external environment as well. So Katz and Kahn, the two primary theories here in open systems theory, really do focus on this relationship between the external environmental forces and the impacts they have on the organization, as well as the way the organization can then have impacts upon the external environment. And if we think about how organizations can impact their external environment, the services that they provide to citizens in that environment, the expertise that they provide in terms of reports and studies that they can provide to the external environment, the contributions they can make to the economy in terms of having employees, paying employees salaries, employees go out and spend that money into the economy. Obviously, those are all impacts the organization can then have on its environment. But in this steady state, this homeostasis point in open systems theory is, again, finding that proper balance so that the organization can support the environment and the environment can support the organization. So with open systems theory, in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, obviously open systems is the primary model that's being emphasized. We don't have to spend a lot of time talking about that because I think that's pretty clear and pretty upfront. In terms of the mechanisms for coordination and control, just like with structural functional theory, we're not really emphasizing any of them because it depends upon the specific unique characteristics of the external environment. Same type of thing with the motivational strategies. It really is going to depend upon the characteristics and the nature of the external environment. So there's really no one best or most appropriate way to motivate employees under open systems theory. But open systems theory really does, no pun intended, open up a new way for us to look at our organizations, where we start looking beyond the walls of our organizations, kind of in what political scientists might call a post-behavioralist type of an approach, where we start looking at the external environment and how the organization fits within that external environment. I think for all of us who work in public organizations, it is sometimes very difficult for us to find examples of public organizations that are operating within closed environments or closed systems. The vast majority of our organizations operate within an open system. And that's especially true here in the state of California. Here in California, we have a lot of transparency requirements. We have public records laws. We have a lot of things that open our organizations up to a lot of scrutiny. We have an emphasis placed upon public-private partnerships and community partnerships. So I think the vast majority, if not all, truly public organizations tend to operate within an open system. It's kind of hard to find examples of organizations that are in a more closed system outside of the private sector and maybe to a little lesser degree in the nonprofit sector. But for the most part, we are all subject to open systems theory here in the public sector. That's kind of an overview of systems theory, natural systems theory, open systems theory, and then Merton's structural functional theory is a nice segue, a nice bridge between those two kind of polar extremes when we view systems. That takes us up through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What we'll then move to next week is we'll then move into a discussion of some of the more modern organization theorists. We'll move into discussions of group dynamics. We'll talk about leadership. We'll talk about organization culture. We'll talk a bit about quality management, and we'll bring it up to the modern point in time in terms of perspectives and ways in which we can view our organizations. And that's kind of where we are going from here. If anyone wants to do their presentation next week, you are certainly very welcome to do that. If you would like to do your presentation next week, I would ask that you send me an email and just let me know that in advance. We could probably accommodate 3 or 4 presentations next week. And then on the 17th, we will then do all the remaining presentations. Then on Saturday, the 22nd, if there are any presentations left to wrap up, we'll wrap those up on the 22nd. And then I'll spend the lion's share of the time on the 22nd introducing you to PPA 697. Hopefully, Dr. Butts will have the 697 site set up by then, and I can take you through the 5 cases and kind of show you what you're going to be doing in those 5 cases, and just kind of talk to you a little bit about how the way in which 697 will work. There won't be a 697 Zoom session on June 29th because Dr. Butts, it's his birthday, so he's going to be going out of town. My daughter is getting married the next day, so I'm going to be out of town as well. So we'll try and get this introduction to 697 done in the second half of our class on the 22nd. Okay? All right. Well, thank you very much. If you have any questions about systems theory, feel free to reach out to me via email. Otherwise, we'll be back at it again next week, hopefully with more technical success, and we will talk about modern organization theories. So take care and have a great week.